Hi, I am one of the many refugees migrating from Windows to Linux after Windows 10 support has ended. Mostly because my 5-year-old gaming PC supposedly can't handle the amounts of bloatware and invasive pop-ups or whatever Windows 11 wants to shove down my throat, but also because I'm not upgrading to a version of Windows where AI can take screenshots and analyze my activity, just in case that I'm experiencing early onset dementia. I don't care if it's optional. I don't want that shit on my PC, I don't want it taking up processing power or disk space to run an OS that gets less useful with every iteration, and I simply don't trust megacorporations like Microsoft. This feels like surveillance and a privacy nightmare, and with the way the world is going at the moment, I'm taking steps to keep a low profile online. So, hardware limitations and learning about Microsoft Recall were really the last straws it took for me to bite the bullet and consider migrating to Linux. After about 2 hours of research which distro is the most user-friendly for Windows users and what I need to do to install it, I went ahead and tried Linux on my cheap Medion laptop that I have been using since high school. Its performance had declined to a point where I could barely run Google Chrome and Microsoft Word at the same time without the whole system freezing up every few minutes. So this was also my last-ditch effort to save it before looking for a new machine. I bought a USB stick, flashed a copy of Linux Mint XFCE onto it, and installed it in a matter of maybe 30 minutes, and lo and behold, my laptop runs smoothly enough that I've actually started using it in lectures and for working on my papers when I have time to spare during the day again. I just saved a couple €100 simply by installing a relatively lightweight version of Linux on a machine I consider trashing entirely. That in itself was such a delightful experience, especially as a university student struggling financially. But on top of that, I've also found the experience of using Linux Mint in general to be pleasantly simple and streamlined in a good way. No longer am I bombarded with subtle advertising before even logging into my PC, and the setup process isn't asking me to sign up and share unspecified user data with some Microsoft service. Instead, I log in and am greeted by a welcome screen that informs me about the most important settings and features that I should be aware of, where I can find documentation about my operating system, and where I can ask for help if all else fails. After I'm done setting up my system, I'm left to my own devices with the terminal, Firefox, which I have been meaning to switch to anyways, as well as the file manager and the menu button, the latter of which opens up to show me a bunch of software that came with the operating system. Now, you may remember me complaining about bloatware coming with an operating system just a minute ago, but look at this. There are no sponsored news articles, no weather forecasts, no stock exchange news, and no Candy Crush replacement. And if I scroll through the pre-installed apps, they're all very sensible utility software, as well as some stuff I've installed myself before starting work on this video. To illustrate the extent of pre-installed software, let me show you the disk usage analyzer. If we check the SSD onto which I installed Linux, we can see that I'm currently using about 105 GB of disk space. If we go into the analysis here, we can see on the ring chart that from the 105 GB used, about 40 GB are my installation of Steam and Team Fortress 2, about 11 GB are pictures, cache data and videos, and about 32 GB are timeshift snapshots, which are backups. So that leaves us with about 20 GB that make up the operating system, which I think is pretty neat. Of course, this disk usage analyzer lacks some of the user-friendliness of its Windows counterpart, but I think the ring chart is actually a pretty convenient visualization of folder structures once you get the hang of it. Speaking of software though, one of my preconceived notions about Linux was that it's just a pain to install and get software to run. Now, I won't lie to you, there definitely are some drawbacks to Linux in that regard. For example, a lot of popular creative software doesn't run on Linux, perhaps most notably the Adobe suite. While I'm nowhere near rich enough to actually pay for an Adobe subscription, I've been using Photoshop and InDesign for a while now, and I haven't found an open source alternative I'm comfortable with for these two just yet. So you might want to consider installing Linux on a fresh SSD like I did, and keep some version of Windows around using dual boot if you happen to be using any proprietary creative software. Other than that though, the free open source alternatives I've tried have all been doing their job well enough for me. For example, this video will be my first made with the recording software OBS and the video editor Kdenlive instead of Shadowplay and Vegas 14. Linux Mint also comes with LibreOffice, which is an alternative to Microsoft Office 365. It takes some getting used to if you have the Office 365 menus and shortcuts memorized, but it's a perfectly adequate package for private use, and I'll also be using it for my academic work from now on. For your other software needs, Linux Mint also comes with a feature I didn't expect on PC, the Software Manager. This essentially works as an app store, with most, if not all, of the software being free to download and use. Now, the Software Manager is far from being a complete library of every Linux application that is out there, but it's simple and curated by the Linux Mint developers, so it's easy and safe to use. Of course, you can also download software from the internet or install it via the terminal at your own risk. Be aware, however, that when you install an app using a command like sudo apt install, you're being asked for your password because you are granting system-wide permissions to whatever you are installing. You could really fuck yourself over if you enter some installation commands you found online, but at least Linux treats you like an adult that can take responsibility for their actions, so just make sure you know what and who you are downloading from and do a bit of research beforehand if necessary. As for gaming on Linux, I've only tried Team Fortress 2 so far, which has had Linux support since 2013. I may or may not make a follow-up video in the future, but as you might have heard in recent media coverage, Valve's decade-long commitment to Linux has been a great driving factor in making the majority of games on Steam playable on Linux via the Proton compatibility layer. And I'm expecting this trend to continue now that Valve has announced a new hardware lineup, all running SteamOS, an Arch-based Linux operating system. Another interesting thing to note about the Linux experience is that every other day or so, this little shield icon on the taskbar, or panel as it's called in Linux, will look different. This tells you that there are updates available for your installed software. You will quickly get into the habit of opening the update manager after booting up your PC, and it's a weirdly pleasant thing to keep track of and manually authorize these updates. And this ties back into the general message I'm trying to convey with this video. Linux Mint feels like a way less cluttered, less bogged down experience than modern Windows. I feel like I am actually in control of my system again, instead of Windows kicking down my door to install updates, overwhelming me with pop-ups I don't want to see, or hiding basic options by removing them from context menus or hiding them from the regular settings menu. My computer is my machine, my tool again, whereas using Windows sometimes feels like I'm being the tool in this situation, or I'm having an overbearing parental figure. Maybe most of all, using Linux also just kind of feels like sticking it to the man, especially if you combine the transition away from Microsoft with a transition away from other corporations like Google, and you start to take your online privacy more seriously. It takes a bit of resilience to troubleshoot things sometimes, but the rewarding feeling of tinkering with and figuring out your machine makes up for it and can actually be a lot of fun in my experience. I have certainly become more interested in doing things myself, and want to look into self-hosting cloud storage for my files next, so that I can eventually move away from using services like Google Drive or Spotify, who are now both invested in AI weapons research, among many other things I don't want to be involved in. And yeah, some of the software might be less feature-rich or fine-tuned than mainstream proprietary software, but free open source software feels like a window into a world where software development isn't driven purely by profit, but by collaborative efforts and free association, so that everyone can freely utilize the power of the technology that they own without being dependent on the support of private corporate monopolies to keep it running. And this is more relevant than ever, now that Microsoft seems to be deliberately causing massive amounts of e-waste by barring Windows 11 behind arbitrarily high system requirements. Luckily, many people, such as myself, are refusing to throw away their perfectly functional PCs and are switching to Linux instead. Of course, it would be misleading to label open source software as somehow inherently socialist or anarchist. That's just not the reality for a lot of developers, and many of them have differing views about the philosophy of open source. But it does feel like an alternative to the rigid systems of intellectual property, corporate control, and enshittification we've become accustomed to. To me, it feels like proof that with some grit and effort, we can make our own systems from the bottom up, which is a liberating idea I try to pursue in any way I can. Thanks for watching.